All right, so today we're going to jump back in time, way back to 1679, to dig into a really fascinating work by the Puritan writer John Bunyan. He wrote this book called A Treatise of the Fear of God, and it tackles an idea that, let's be honest, can sound pretty strange to us today. And that brings us right to the heart of the matter, the central puzzle we're going to unpack. Why on earth would Bunyan, a deeply religious man, argue that we should actually fear a God that he also says is all-loving and merciful? I mean, that sounds like a huge contradiction, right? So to figure this out, we have to get our heads around a really key point that Bunyan makes right up front. For him, not all fear is the same, not even close. Now, you've probably heard of John Bunyan. He's the guy who wrote the super famous book, The Pilgrim's Progress, and he was really good at taking these big, complex spiritual ideas and making them, well, understandable. In this book, he basically says that the word fear is way too simple. He argues there are different kinds of fear, a destructive type that pushes us away from God, and another, totally different kind of fear that he believed was absolutely essential for salvation. Okay, so let's start with the bad stuff. Let's talk about the kind of fear Bunyan flags as being, toxic and ungodly. He's very clear that this is the fear we need to run from. He calls this ungodly or slavish fear, and that word slavish is so important. Think about the kind of terror a slave would feel for a cruel, unpredictable master. It's a fear that's all about dreading punishment. And what does it make you want to do? It makes you want to run and hide, to get as far away as possible.
For Bunyan, the classic example of this is Adam in the Garden of Eden. In the story, right after he disobeys God, he hears God's voice. And what's his first instinct? It's not to go ask for forgiveness. Nope. His fear makes him hide. And that act of hiding creates this massive gulf between him and God.
So this slavish fear, Bunyan says, it only produces garbage. It leads to discontent and complaining. It makes you want to flee from God's presence, and it just kills any motivation for religious practice. It basically paralyzes you, leading to spiritual laziness and doing nothing at all.
But Bunyan doesn't just leave it at that. He introduces another kind of fear. What he says is temporary, but totally necessary. It's kind of like a spiritual alarm clock. He calls this the fear of damnation. And for a Puritan, damnation, being eternally separated from God's goodness, was the ultimate bad outcome. So this is that gut punch moment of crisis when a person is forced to look at their own failures and the incredibly serious consequences. But for Bunyan, this isn't where you're supposed to stay. It's the shock you need to realize you need help.
And to show us what he means, Bunyan points to a story in the Bible about a jailer. This guy's guarding the apostles Paul and Silas when a massive earthquake hits. The jailer is terrified, trembling, and he cries out, "What must I do to be saved?" That right there, for Bunyan, is the awakening fear in action. The terror pushes him to seek an answer. It's a means to an end, not the end itself.
And this, right here, is the climax of Bunyan's whole argument. This is the solution to that paradox we started with, the true, godly fear that he thinks every believer should try to develop.
He calls it filial fear. Now, filial is just an old word that comes from the Latin for son or child, and that's the whole key. This isn't the fear a slave has for a master. It's the deep, loving reverence a child feels for a good parent. You're not afraid of being hurt. You're afraid of disappointing someone you love and respect more than anything.
And this is where the logic does a complete flip, in a good way. Bunyan uses this verse from the Psalms to argue that true godly fear is born not from God's anger, but from his mercy. The fact that God is willing to forgive is what's supposed to inspire this profound awe. It's God's goodness, not his wrath, that makes him worthy of this special kind of fear.
So when you put them side by side, the contrast is just stark. The slave's dread makes you run away from the master, while the child's reverence makes you want to draw closer to the father. One is all about avoiding punishment. The other is motivated by love. And this is the bottom line. Slavish fear leads to despair, while this filial fear leads to hope.
So what's the point of all this? What does this filial fear actually do in a person's life? Well, Bunyan lays out some really positive, life-changing effects. Okay, so first, he says it makes you genuinely hate evil, not because you're scared of getting caught, but because you love God and you don't want to do anything to damage that relationship. Second, Bunyan calls it a fountain of life because it acts like a moral compass, constantly guiding you toward what's good and away from spiritual danger. And finally, he says this reverential fear is the starting point, the very foundation for all true wisdom.
So in the end, Bunyan leaves us with this really powerful question, one that still hits home today, and forces us to look at our own anxieties.
The fear in your life, is it building walls, making you hide like Adam in the garden? Or is it a kind of reverential awe that actually builds wisdom, drawing you closer to what truly matters?